All right, here we go with objective 65, solving quadratic equations by square roots, part 2. So this is going to be quite similar to the previous objective, but we're just going to take it one step further. So I think you'll like this one. It's quite similar. Let's take a look at that first example that we studied in the previous objective, which is x squared minus 8 equals 17. Remember, in order to solve this for x, we would get x squared by itself by adding 8 to both sides. So we would have x squared equals 25. And then we square root both sides. So we have x equals the square root of 25. So we have plus or minus 5 because we're solving equations, right? And then this would be the two solutions, x equals 5, x equals negative 5. So what we're going to study today is quite similar to this, but we're just going to take it another step further. Taking a look at this, again, this one's quite similar to that first warm-up problem that we did last time. So to get this by itself, the variable by itself, we have to first add 8. So remember, reverse PEMDAS. So now we have 17 plus 8 is 25. And then we have the quantity x minus 2 squared. So really, this isn't all that different, but now instead of x squared, we have x minus 2 quantity squared. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to square root both sides. The square and square root cancel. And then instead of x, we're just left with x minus 2. Now, since we're solving equations, the same is true here. The square root of 25, we're going to say plus or minus 5. Right? When solving equations, we got to include both. Now, in order to solve this, see how we broke up our solution into two different equations? We're going to do the same here. So instead of x minus 2 equals plus or minus 5, we're going to say x minus 2, and I'm going to bring that up here, equals positive 5, and then x minus 2 equals negative 5. So we're going to choose both positive and negative 5, and we're going to set our equation equal to that. And then solving each of these, we've got plus 2 on both sides. So we have x equals 7. And then adding 2 to both sides, we have x equals negative 3. So see, we still have two solutions. We still had to set it equal to plus or minus 5. But notice there's one more step after we do that. So let's go ahead and write a definition. So this is going to be quite similar to the previous objective. And you can put a big star next to this. We can only use this when you have an x squared or a parentheses squared. So now we're adding in parentheses squared. If you have an x squared and an x, then you have to use another method. So you can only use this when you have an x squared, only an x squared, or only parentheses squared. If you have an x squared and an x, then you cannot use this method. You got to use another method. So let's take a look at this first one down here. Well, do we have an x squared or a parentheses squared and nothing else? I see that we have the parentheses squared, so that's good. This meets the criteria. So in order to solve this, step 1 is to get the x squared or the parentheses squared by itself. So just like when we solved in the previous objective, we got to get it by itself, that squared term. So let's do that here. We're going to get that by itself. First thing we do is subtract 4 from both sides. So subtracting 4, we have the quantity x minus 3 squared equals, well, 68 minus 4 is 64. Awesome. So now we have our parentheses squared by itself. Step 2, we're going to follow just like the previous objective. We're going to square root both sides. And you can put a note next to this. Remember the plus or minus. It's got to be both positive and negative. Remember the plus or minus. A lot of students forget it. So let's do that down here. We're going to square root both sides. On the left-hand side of the equation, our square and square root cancel one another. So we're just left with the quantity x minus 3. And then on the right-hand side, the square root of 64, let's go ahead and use the jailbreak method. So factors of 64, you could say 16 and 4. You could say 8 and 8. I'm going to choose 8 and 8 because I know that's a pair. And we can pull those right out. You might also recognize 64 is a perfect square. So you can just know that the square root of 64 is 8. But since we're solving equations, we have to include both plus and minus, so positive and negative 8. Now, step 3, now that we've square rooted both sides, step 3 is to write out both equations and solve for the variable. Write out both equations and solve for the variable. So let's go ahead and break this apart into two equations. We've got x minus 3 equals plus or minus 8. We're going to break that apart into x minus 3 equals positive 8 and x minus 3 equals negative 8. So then solving this, we have to add 3 to both sides. So we get x equals 11. That's one solution. Adding 3 to this side, we get x equals negative 5. And those are our two solutions. Let's try one more example. So looking at this, do we have an x squared or a parentheses squared and nothing else? We sure do. There's no other y's. There's just the parentheses squared. So now step 1, let's get it by itself. So reverse PEMDAS, the first thing that we have to deal with is the addition and subtraction. I see that here. So we have to add 9 to get rid of that minus 9. So then we have 63 plus 9 is 72. So then we have 2 times the quantity y plus 2 squared. All right. Moving along in reverse PEMDAS, we got to deal with that multiplication and division. I see that we've got 2 times this quantity, so we got to divide by 2. So the 2's cancel, and we're left with just y plus 2 quantity squared. On the right-hand side, we have 72 divided by 2. That's 36. And then we can move on to step 2, which is square root both sides. So we're going to square root both sides. The square and square root cancel with one another, so we're just left with y plus 2. And then on the right-hand side, the square root of 36, well, 36 is 6 times 6. So we know that the square root of 36 when solving equations is plus or minus 6. So remember that plus or minus. Now, step 3, we're going to write out both equations and solve for the variable. So we're going to write out y plus 2 equals positive 6 and y plus 2 equals negative 6. Now we got to solve each of these equations. We're going to subtract 2 from both sides, and we're left with y equals 6 minus 2 is 4. So we have one solution, y equals 4. And then we're going to subtract 2 from both sides, and we have y equals negative 8. So those are our two solutions, 4 and negative 8. So a quick reminder, this only works when you have an x or a parentheses squared, not when you have an x squared and x. You got to get it by itself, that squared term by itself, square root both sides, remember your plus and minus, and then write out both equations and solve for the variable. We're going to get a whole lot of practice on this, so we'll study up and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day.